Hello. I'm here seconds early. I have had people commenting occasionally, "Oh, look at you! You are dressed up properly for the live stream." Well, this live stream on Mondays is you guys joining me and getting to bug me about questions about plugins or whatever else is going on. So, for that reason, if I want to wear warm clothing or whatever, I shall. And if I'm sick, I shall show up anyhow. And because you can't really catch a cold over the internet. And this is just, come into MySpace. Not literally MySpace. Literally MySpace is a little bit obsolete. But Mondays you come and visit me. Hey, Bo. Bo is somebody who often comes and visits me. And what I've got today, apart from my cup of coffee, yay. If you follow me on Instagram, you are first again. You're always first. You're often first. If you follow me on Instagram, you will have seen another one of my funny little perf board, circuit board type constructions. That is actually right there, and you'll see that everything is lit up and flashing, and there's a reason for that. The reason everything is lit up and flashing is that I'm going to demonstrate the thing that I just built. And on my pieces of paper, I will draw up how to do it. Unless people so much don't want to hear about that they go, no, don't tell us anything. Because what I've done is I've built the circuit out two different circuits, actually. One of them is out of a capacitor, and one of them is out of one of those little transformers, much like the ones from the infundibulator, the magneto. God, it wouldn't be magneto-optical. Magneto-inductive, perhaps? The infundibulator, in other words, that thing that I built that I run everything through. Oh, have you got a question? There are no stupid questions. People keep trying to delete their questions when they think that they are stupid, and you must understand that you should explore everything, because the times when you didn't get something right, firstly, somebody might learn from that, and secondly, those are the things that you learn on. Hey! David Pixley has made it. How you doing? I haven't seen you for a couple of weeks. And David goes through ups and downs and stuff. If you do Minecraft playing, you might have a chance to come and play with some of us audio nerds at some point, David, depending upon what kind of time you have. When I was in a life situation similar to yours, I had all the time in the world, but nothing much else. So that could be a thing. In any case, I have built a new thing, and it is with a transformer, which I am abusing and using improperly. And I'm very fond of the results that I got, so I'm going to show people. Yeah, I saw that you were in Vegas. I see David on Facebook, although I don't really interact with people on Facebook, but it's one way of finding things out or observing stuff. How come Console 6 and its formula sounds much better than those wave shapers? Define those wave shapers. Oh, not a problem. I'm not sure what those wave shapers exactly means. But yeah, one thing about today is I've got everything turned on and lit up, so I can demonstrate a couple of different things, and one of them is that, which is those are both the Kurzweil, but I changed my setup around so that I can play stuff on this keyboard or play stuff with that, but then I can also drive it with this, and I was just experimenting with it earlier to work out how I can run this into that and also play on the keyboards, and I can set this to a different MIDI channel. So my next goal is to pick out a set of sounds, assign it to the MIDI inputs on this guy, and then it'll be, pick bells or piano or whatever on this, have that repeating, and then pick something else for leads, and then be able to swap stuff around a little bit more easily rather than just having to type in individual tones off of my big list with the colors. And the colors have to do with what style of sound that would be. I try to associate the different sounds that they produced with colors because they're all kind of synthetic anyhow. Kurzweil is not the most synthetic of keyboards as far as these Romplers go, but all the same, it's not really quite the same as having a live instrument, is it? So yeah, I don't know what Stillwell Bad Bus Mojo is. However, I've run into some plugins where the algorithm they used had some kind of little artifact in there. Like, I remember early on, I was doing some experiments with channel based on the fact that I ran into an algorithm, and I believe it was a plugin called Cyanide that let me move around distortion and positions and where you started distorting and where the signal was clean. You got to sculpt the transfer function a lot, but I wanted to do my own version of it because when I ran sine wave through this, which is always a good way of determining that kind of stuff, I heard overtones. So what I would say is, if you've got a wave shaper and you want to determine how it's going to work, what you need to do is take some nice low frequency sine wave, like a 30 hertz, maybe 40 hertz, maybe even lower, like 20 or 25 hertz or something like that. Run it through the wave shaper and make it do stuff, and see whether there's any sort of high frequency stuff peeking through that's not supposed to be there. Because that's a situation where you can start perceiving like little corner points. Got the paper out, I might as well start showing it, where you got your sine wave kind of thing, and if you do a wave shaper where it goes where it does something like that, you can ask anything about audio EB, go ahead. In fact, as long as people are behaving themselves, I will not only not vanish you, but I'll turn it to live chat to make sure that everything gets through, which is one of my technologies for if things get too saucy around here. But as you can see with this picture, I've drawn it where the curve goes up, and then it hits this point, and there's a sharp little corner that I highlighted with the detail there. And you'll be able to hear that corner as a kind of high frequency overtone, because literally that's what's happening. Like if you had a span or something where it's measuring the tone, and then you're producing this, which is going to make a couple of harmonics, probably only a couple of harmonics, like a third or fifth, whatever, then this little thing, the little corner there, would show up as a whole series of little tiny harmonics way the hell up there, because it's a sharp corner. It's a little point that's not supposed to be there. And if you had a calculation that was being done, I'm writing some numbers down to indicate this is what the transfer function would do. programming errors and problems can do things like this. Suppose you have a thing where your number is increasing, and you're trying to make it so that it hits the wall and stops increasing even as it keeps going up. You do a calculation where it's like, okay, we're going to go here, and if we're past this point, then the amount that is added is less of what was originally there. So you're going like 8, 9, 9.7, 9.9, 9.99, 11. If you make a problem in the coding, or do something like, it repeats the 9.99 when it's not supposed to, or something like that, that produces a little tiny artifact every time you go past that point. Like, I'm not sure what kind of coding problem would cause the issue of, like, we're at 9, we're going closer and closer to 10, except for, whoops, all of a sudden it's 11 instead of 10. That would be a transfer function that acted more like this, where you're going up to this point, and then all of a sudden there's this discontinuity because your calculation was wrong, and instead it's giving this number. So the number goes up and then makes this little jump, and every time you pass that point, the audio will make that little jump. It'll be a little tick in every single cycle of every waveform as you go past that point. And you might think that that sounds kind of crazy, except that exists in known plugins. I would suggest you run a... I'm not going to say who it is with words. But one of the reasons I started doing iron oxide in the first place was that there was a particular company and a particular product that some of my friends liked that they were having trouble with their tech support. And I ran test tones through this. I don't know whether it's still the same as it was, but this particular plugin that I'm not saying out loud, if you ran stuff through a sine wave, through their thing, there would be a little discontinuity in the sound of their plugin. And if you run a sine wave that is ramping in volume, it has to... nobody will never know what that was. If you run a sine wave that is ramping in volume, it's going from quiet to loud and loud to quiet again. And it's the same low frequency, like it could be 30, it could be a higher frequency like 60 hertz. And you run it through certain plugins, at least back when I was doing it, and they may have just stayed because it might be part of the algorithm now. People are used to hearing that from it. There will be a discontinuity at a certain point in the amplitude, and as the sound passes that discontinuity, it produces that little tick, and it produces a kind of weird flangey buzz that shifts in pitch. It sounds like a flanger because it'll be like... So, Ahmed has a question which I am going to try to answer. And weird questions are great. Dumb questions are even better. So I'm going to keep harassing people to ask any question without worrying about whether it was dumb or whether they're wrong or have the wrong assumptions, because that's the stuff you learn on. It's really important to be okay with getting stuff wrong every now and then. It is possible to take, something? I'm working on an idea for exactly that. I literally am. I'm going to need my brother's help because it's going to be a complicated plugin and probably really CPU hungry. And it might take a while. But basically, if you have a waveform, and your waveform kind of goes like this, and the zero crossings are like that, and you took this, and for every single zero crossing at whatever polarity it is, you took that entire collection of samples and sorted them. And sorted them with the center of it being loudest. What you're going to get is a symmetrical waveform that approximates a sine wave. Maybe it'll be like a funny kind of spike wave. If it's really more spiky, it'll relocate the positions of waves. Or if it was a square wave, it becomes literally a square wave again. But it'll make symmetrical waves out of it. What you want to do is sort stuff around the middle point. And I'm going to see whether I can do that even if it ends up being kind of CPU hungry. Because the way that works is it could end up being rather CPU hungry. So it might not be the most effective way of going about things. But it's an idea. I think I got it on stream at some point. One of the great things about streams is I'll get ideas for stuff that I can try to do. And then I can do them and put them out as free plugins. So it's all good. But yeah, that would be kind of like that. I don't know. I have not yet done that, so I don't know. But that, as near as I can tell, I think it would work, and I think it would be cool. I don't think anybody's done it because it's kind of awkward and cumbersome, and me and Dan are going to be running into problems as far as incorporating it, because you're going to incur lots of latency doing that. You have to have at least, we don't care. Any sorting algorithm, as long as it sorts around the middle and stuff. You could do ramp waves. You could do sawtooth waves and just sort always towards the front or the end of the thing. But Dan thought that maybe what would be best is to sort stuff just as normally and then reassign it. But yeah, the algorithm doesn't matter. I'm very curious as to whether there's one that would work particularly well with audio stuff. And it also doesn't necessarily have to be perfect, because perfect is just having to do with the purity of the sound. Whereas getting stuff pretty close to where you want it would have advantageous results anyhow. So in theory, you could kind of do that, because it's literally what I'm hoping I'll be able to do at some point. If anybody does it before me, that'll be cool, and I'll just check it out and be like, huh, that was neat. If you wanted to do the opposite, what you could do is do this sorting and then subtract it from what you had, and that would tend to remove the harmonics. That's just a phase issue. That would be just subtracting the phase. But yeah. But it's not really, that wouldn't really be cutting the harmonics so much as just resynthesizing a sound based on what samples you had. So the reason I gravitated towards the idea is because it would be, and the speed of the sorting is big time going to be a factor. The larger the sample, you're going to have hundreds or, well, I'm not sure if it would go quite to thousands. Probably 1,000 would be about your limit. Like 44.1 kilohertz, that's 44,000 hertz. And if I grab my little pocket calculator, I'm the operator of my pocket calculator, as Kraftwerk would have it. And I divide that by 20 hertz, 20 cycles per second. I'd have 2,205 samples. Now, a cycle is positive and negative because it repeats rather than simply repeating only in one side. So 20 cycles per second goes through positive and negative. So each of the sortings would be just a hair over 1,000. And that's at 20 cycles per second, which is low enough that, you're going to observe the thundery qualities of it if you have big enough subwoofers, but it's not going to really register for your ear. So 1,000 should do ya. I'll make a little note of that because it's fairly reasonable. And then the problem that you have with making a plugin like this, 1,000 samples should do you. then if you have stuff that doesn't fit within that, or stuff that's going past your sample buffer, White Sea Snake Oil Guy has tuned in from time to time and might be tuning in now. In fact, he was talking to me about some stuff about an upcoming video, and I sent an email back where he's done a really good job of trying to pick up on some of the stuff, and then some of the details are either unclear or he didn't have them perfectly, and I was like, dude, post your video anyway. Don't worry about fixing it. What you worry about is learning as you go forwards. And the dark pattern of getting stuff wrong on the internet is, if you get stuff wrong on the internet, people will come out of the woodwork to correct you, and that is all engagement. So you don't necessarily want to rely upon that kind of stuff, because it leads to just doing stuff. Like, there are YouTube channels doing things like, the top 50 guitar solos of all time, and they'll do stuff and make an elaborate video for that kind of thing, and then they will skip the best one specifically so that people will complain, or they'll put something annoying at the very top specifically so that people will complain, because engagement is attention, and everybody has to find their own way around that kind of thing, I think. So yeah, I've got a lot of postings, so let me follow through quickly. I'm glad that the posting is relaxing. That's one of the reasons that I'm not like dicked out and, video close-up makeup and my fancy shirt and all that kind of thing. Monday is a chill stream. Monday is, there should be no strain, and I will insist that nobody feel bad about asking a dumb question or anything like that. I'm going to make a real big point of that every time I see it. Never ask a question that you decided was dumb because I said, no, actually, and then delete the question or feel bad about it, because it's important to, communicate and talk and think and stuff. So EB has a really interesting observation here, and I think I've got it set up so that if I highlight, you can see it. So EB says, I have issues mixing electric bass because I don't know how to treat the mid-range and high mid, so it cuts through my mixes. Funny you should mention that, because the thing about it is that's sometimes totally what you want. Like, I have set up bass sounds sometimes specifically to distort or hype out mid-range and high mids so that it will cut through mixes. In fact, I have a plugin that's coming up. It's the Secret Weapon plugin bass drive that a number of people, including Slipperman, the famous Slipperman, is fond of that one, even though it doesn't actually. That one likes to run at 44.1K, so it doesn't adjust itself to higher sample rates, which is a bit of a drag, but that is one of the Secret Weapon plugs that people like. And the reason it's doing that is because it does distortion on top of the bands that it's using. So you should follow up with a question, because there's times, like if you're doing a dub techno thing, and dub techno, of course, is a techno genre which is just very low frequency and thumping, and there's a lot of space, and there's a lot of distance and reverb and echoes, and I love the heck out of it. I love doing that stuff. But with that, you might not want your bass to be loud and scrapey in the mid-range. So what I would ask is, what more do you want to know about mixing electric bass and what to do for it? Because often that's what makes the bass be audible in the mix at all. And if it is, with the way that you phrased your question, I can't tell whether you want more mid-range and high mids or less. If you're doing dub techno, you might want to remove everything. And there are ways you can do that, like stick a piece of foam under the strings on the bass and then play it with your thumb in a particular way. I will demonstrate. Because you can kind of sort of... Here's a bass. Here I'm going to point that at me a little bit, you can almost hear me. So here's the bass. And if you were trying to do a dub techno thing, you might stuff a sponge over here. These are tape wound. So they're steel, but there's nylon on them. And if I move the mic a little bit closer, technically I could run this through the board, but that's far too much trouble right now. If I use my fingernail to pluck it, you get all kinds of mid-range and high mids and such. But if I use the ball of my thumb, and also notice my hands on the strings. That's one way to get a kind of reggae tone, is mute the strings, put foam in there, use your hand on the bridge, or you can't really go farther up because you stop having any sustain, but you put your hand down here and then use the ball of your thumb, and that's a way to get a really round tone compared to. And of course, where you pick with your finger matters too. So yeah, and this is all important stuff because you can't always go by plugins for this kind of thing. You would struggle to translate this into this. So the way that works is you're going to look at initial sound, and that is one of the things, again, back to EB, who hasn't continued, but you can follow up and ask more questions as you go. If it's about making the mid-range and high mids cut through more, you might try playing it differently, use a pick or something like that, play differently on the string. It's all about how you handle the string if you're playing electric bass. And if you've got somebody who's playing really poorly and you're stuck mixing them, then that becomes the challenge. That becomes the issue. Whereas if you're trying to make it be more muffled so that it cuts through less and is more of a... I was just watching a video this morning with a guy who was talking about Andy Wallace mixes. And he raised some interesting points that counted as criticisms, I guess, but also I was like, oh, hey, I know exactly why he did that. And he was talking about Andy Wallace's bass guitar mixing. And one of the things that the guy was saying, which was like kind of like a criticism or kind of just how he got those sounds, is that Andy Wallace liked throwing chorus on the bass all the time. And I know one reason why that would be advantageous and help to construct the sound. Actually, I was telling Whitesea just this morning, you can thumbs up, you can thumbs down. It doesn't matter because it goes to the same figure. Both of those buttons do the same thing on YouTube. If you didn't know this, this will blow your mind. If you do a thumbs up, it increments a little thing saying engagement. If you do a thumbs down, it increments a little thing saying engagement. I don't know if it's literally true that they're both technically the same button, that they go to the same thing, but I'd like to believe that that is so because it's hilarious. And in essence, that's kind of how that works. It might be... There might be more sophistication, like, you'll do that and the amount of engagement for the receiving video is going to be the same, but it might do things for your own account, saying like, oh, okay, so your account wants to see lots more of this, or I don't think YouTube really does your account wants to see less of this. There's one specific way that your account can see less of things, and that is if you go to stuff in your sidebar, and say, I don't want to see this video, and then follow up with the thing where it's like, why don't you want to see this video? And you follow that up by saying, I don't want to see anything from this channel at all. That actually can clear out your recommendations pretty nicely, and I do that constantly. Anytime I watch a video where I haven't controlled, it's like, uh-oh, this is a video touching on politics or something like that, which means that my recommendations are going to be loaded with stuff that, if you like that, you might want to see this, and then it's their opportunity to really tell you what you should be watching. So then I have to go through and go like, okay, so incredibly political channel that is people who are really angry and yelling, and that's the name of the channel. I go, okay, I don't want to see this video. Why? Because I don't want to see this whole channel, incredibly angry political channel that is always yelling. And you tell it, I don't want to see that, and then they can piece. That is what you got to do in order to piece it together so that the side of your screen when watching videos isn't just a garbage fire, because usually it's going to be just a garbage fire in many different ways. Like, I can get garbage fires going on politics. I can get garbage fires going on, like, flat earth aficionados and weird science and this one weird trick and, or cake decorating, who knows. There's just all manner of craziness that you can get into with a very primitive AI trying to manipulate you on a statistical basis by getting you to be more like what it thinks you are. Because the benefit there is, if YouTube can get you to be more like what you are, you might sit around watching videos more. And that's what's in it for them. A lot of that stuff is very simple. A lot of things, whether it be AIs or human intelligence or whatever, we fall back on very simple things like, people want to eat food and sleep and play and screw and stuff like that. And so much human behavior falls back on these basic people want to do things like be dominant or fight or whatever. And that's a really simple animal drive. That's an animal drive like wanting to eat or wanting to have sex or something like that is particularly males. I think that's basically guys. Because I'm in recovery. Because a bunch of years ago I did all the drugs I'm ever going to need in my life and had to stop. And so I do a recovery thing. I have a sponsor which is kind of like, your really close friend you can tell stuff to, who is also learning and growing. And my sponsor was telling me about guys can be really aggressive, and this is not necessarily a bad thing. It just kind of, you do it within the context of something that's healthy. But getting pugnacious and being fighty, or being like, climbing mountains and doing amazing stuff and being really competitive is not necessarily a wrong thing. It's just a human thing. It's a quality. And just like that, artificial intelligence, such as Google's algorithms, are going to be driven by some pretty basic drives, like, maximize engagement with YouTube or whatever. It's going to be based on some pretty basic things. So, ideally, when something like AI gets smart, AI will figure out, like, okay, helping to maximize the health of the populations upon which I depend, these humans, would be useful as well. And I think that time is going to come. But the AIs that we're dealing with right now are really primitive, and they're like amoebas. They're like primitive organisms, and all they know how to do is maximize engagement, or, get people to do something that you want, but they aren't really sophisticated as to what they want out of stuff. That might grow as things get more sophisticated. One interesting I'm rereading. one interesting thing about Google's AI is David says down bottom, Google's AI helped me find you after searching for plugins for 5 years. Yes, and did this or did this not make you more like yourself? In some ways, Google's AI and what they're doing and how they're doing it is very effective. It's just that you don't necessarily need to, not everything that they're effective at is necessarily good or nice. There's the capacity for it to be very beneficial and healthy, and there's also the capacity for like dragging unhealthy stuff out of you. So it all kind of depends. I think we might be getting to a point where I'm going to have a quick peek back at the YouTube dashboard page. And unless Whitesy comes and brings his crew, we've got a decent number of folks kicking around. So maybe I should show you the new thing that I built, the transformer-based kick drum thing. What I'll do is set this like this. That's awkward, but that might make it so that you can kind of hear me even though I'm over here. So here is the kick drum thing that I was telling you about. So there's the kick drum. This is a Moog DFAM. And I can do things like we're running off of VCO2. The envelope generator amount is making the pitch thing that you use. Goes a larger pitch motion, or from high down to low. VCO decay is the speed of it. So what I've done is added two things. One of them is a simple filter like this. If I plug this in, it still sounds basically the same, but it's a capacitor in series with the wires. Just the height of this going through a capacitor to that. It's about 0.1 microfarad, and it's a big old film capacitor. So that is taking away some of the sub-lows by way of increasing the mid-bass. Compared to So the purpose of that is to get it so it swoops through the lower mid-bass stuff louder, and then when it drops down to the lowest possible thing, it's cutting volume a little tiny bit. It could also be doing that on the board, but quickly have a glance at I've got some questions coming up. And the second thing is this. It's a, and hopefully with me projecting like this, I'm still going to come through in the microphone. That's the idea anyhow. I do have to watch my loudness when talking directly into it. So if I raise my voice over here, it'll probably be fine. I've done public speaking before, so I know how to do this, and it should work out. I have envelope generators here. So VCF, EG, VCO, EG, VCA, EG. Those are the envelope of each of these things. It goes from a higher voltage down to nothing. And if I say use VCO decay, that's very quick. It's going like Whereas if I do a long decay, it takes much longer for it to go. And I've also got a switch that is VCA envelope generator fast or slow. Slow is stretching it out more. Fast has more of a spike on it. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm running from the VCF envelope generator, which is this. If I turn up the resonance, you can hear it. VCF. And it's going to go down to whatever frequency is set on cutoff. And then the envelope generator amount is going to specify how far up it goes. I can do that on the fly when I'm doing actual sounds. So that same envelope generator that does this, and a larger amount is a higher voltage, is going into a transformer. And the transformer is taking this, and it's 600 ohms to ground. So it's activating the transformer as if it was a frequency. And then the output of the transformer, I've got 2 windings, so it's actually 1200 ohms. And that is set up to be in phase. And again, it's ground to this, which goes to the VCA CV. So what I'm doing is essentially the same thing as taking VCF envelope generator here and plugging it to VCA CV. Hear how it made it louder? Not louder, and then when we add that envelope generator to the VCA, and again the decay, it amplifies it. But if I run it through the transformer, here's the thing. Running it through the transformer now. Transformers can't pass DC. They can't pass battery current. So the whole envelope generator is expecting DC current. I'm running it through a transformer which cannot pass DC current. It's going to cut off. So what we get is only the front of the wave as a sort of additional punch. And what that means is I can go from this. You can already hear the difference there. Take the resonance off. Start doing different adjustments. And then if I plug this in, and again take it, kind of a big difference between this So there you have it. And I can explain that a little bit further on paper or whatever, assuming people want to hear more about it, which you may or may not, depends. But that was the most recent invention And that's the thing that showed up on Instagram. And that's what it does. And it's another one of those things where it's like this, like the subharmonic generator. The subharmonic generator is a CMOS-based, it's a little more complicated, but a CMOS-based thing where I can take a Moog Mother 32, patch one of the oscillators into it, and get a octave-divided output. So that's another one of those ones where I put together a circuit on this perf board that is nothing but a relevant part like the transformer or the chip, and some jacks, and some wires. Like the transformer one doesn't even take power. It's passive. Both the capacitor, which is the high pass, and the transformer, which is giving me my attack bump in a nice, beefy, meaty way, that's entirely passive. I don't even have to power it. It doesn't require anything at all other than just what's there. And it's doing a thing which is akin to a Eurorack thing that I'm anxiously looking forward to the opportunity to one day get, which is the Rabbit Elephant Portal Kick. Is exactly my jam. It's exactly the kind of thing that I would like. And it's doing similar things in similar ways. The way that the Portal Kick is doing its thing is that it has a much more complicated envelope than just what you have out of typical Eurorack VCAs and things. And that's what I've just done there, is take a envelope coming out of the DFAM, run it through this, like I can even show you on paper, because why not? And I'll get to your question, Yuri. I'm demonstrating these very headphones, so. So here's what a envelope might look like. And here's another possible kind of envelope that you'd have in Eurorack, where, it triggers, and it goes to a maximum voltage, and then it decays. Maybe it decays in an exponential kind of way, maybe it decays in a linear kind of way. So what I'm getting when I run through a transformer is like this. A transformer cannot, say this is going over several seconds, a transformer cannot pass DC voltage. You're basically just trying to power the iron core of the transformer and make it be magnetized, carry along this other coil of wire along with that, and then once you've magnetized it, there's actually no more voltage coming out. So a transformer is a really effective high pass over certain frequencies, because it simply cannot produce that much in the way of DC voltage. That's one of the reasons why notable amplifiers like high-ender amplifiers and also some of the guitar amplifiers like high watts, if you have amplifiers that are unusually gutsy and punchy and pack lots of bass and power and stuff, usually they're going to have humongous, giant, heavy transformers with the huge cores and all this winding, because that's the only way to do it. Tiny transformers, you start losing bass and punch and the amount of maximum voltage you can put out of it. And there's a distinction between different kinds of amplifiers and the sizes of transformers you usually have. Like one of the differences between high watt, which is almost all the way to your Fender Twin as far as unbearably loud and punchy, and Marshall, is that the Marshall transformers are simply not as big as Fender Twin transformers, output transformers, or high watt output transformers. So they don't, they can produce extreme volume, but they won't go as far down, and they won't go as loud, unsaturated. Instead, the output saturation of the transformer becomes part of the sound. And that's very interesting. That's also part of the equation for tape heads and recording on magnetic tape, is that part of the equation is you're having to drive a transducer, which is essentially a transformer with a pickup on it. And then on playback, you get that back again. If you record it again, then you're going to have to go through that whole system again. So you run into the same kind of thing where tape heads with lots of tracks on them are going to be more like your Marshall style. And something crazy like 2-inch 8-track, which is barely exists, that is enormous coils in the tape head, enormous central pull piece. I guess you called it a pull piece. The part that records onto the thing. If those are tiny, it's going to limit the amount of power you can put through them. Even if it doesn't burn out, it'll start saturating the coil. And then if they're huge, you can put more power through them. And that's why 2-inch tape with lower track counts, like say 16-track versus a 24-track, is going to be punchier and gutsier because the parts are larger and capable of handling more power. So if you have envelopes, and this is something that does actually, you can do this in digital as well. You could do this in plugins, you could do this in DAWs and synthesizers. Suppose your envelope is like this, and then you run the whole thing through a transformer and take the output of the transformer. First of all, what's going to happen is you're going to have a finite rise time, because the transformer is also an inductor, and an inductor limits the amount of high frequencies you can have too. So a transformer is an enormous bandpass. Like, it cannot put sound through below a certain frequency. And bear in mind that the magnetodynamic infundibulator thing that I built doesn't work like this because that's a wire. What we're talking about is a transformer that takes one coil of wire. It goes through a central core, which isolates the one coil of wire from another coil of wire. And then the other coil of wire gets the same sound because it's inductively coupled by the core of the transformer. That's how transformers work. And guitar pickups happen because... go ahead and ask your question, Bo. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Guitar pickups get their sound because they have the coil of wire and it's inductively coupled to a magnet and then a vibrating metal thing next to the magnet. So it's taking the vibrations of the metal thing near the magnet, and that's causing that to be inductively coupled to a voltage change in the wires. So if you were taking this waveform, this envelope, and running it through a transformer as I've just done, and I just demonstrated it, your rise time is going to be slower because you're going into an inductor and out of another coil on the inductor, and it simply can't react that fast. But there's more. It runs out of steam real fast, like probably even faster than that. Let's say this is just half a second or so. It's a very quick thing, but still, your rise time is slow. It's not to scale. Your rise time is slower, and then you can't just keep putting voltage through here. Like, say, if you've got a voltage and it's like this, your transformer output is going to be just the faintest bit slower. This is more to scale. It's going to be not as loud because you don't really get the same energy out of it. And then it'll die off. You just can't put DC through a transformer. Your low frequency cutoff of the transformer dictates how much of it you get. And another amusing thing about that is if the voltage stops, you're going to get a kind of return effect as it goes back to zero. it's going to try to equalize again because the magnetic core is going to try to go back to the center. And the transition from here to here also counts. In fact, it might be even louder than that. It might go right down to here again. We don't hear so much of that on what I just showed you because the frequencies I'm putting through the envelope are not as strong. But it'll do that. It'll do that. So that's how I'm taking a single passive part and doing a very complicated thing with the punch and impact of the DFAM, which is a pretty darn good kick drum as they go. But, you know, I'm Chris from Airwindows. I got to figure out ways to keep making stuff better always. And so that's basically what I'm trying to do. So, time for me to answer Yuri's question. What I'm using here are Sennheiser HD280 Pros. They don't come with this microphone, so I basically tacked it on, and I've also replaced the wires. And this is a cable from some cheesy phone headset thing that has the 4 conductors, including one for the microphone part. And it was very tricky to get this to work, but Macs such as that one, or at least Macs such as that one that have headphone jacks, are also capable of powering headsets which have a microphone built in. So the actual mic here is not the same element that came with this cable, which is not long enough. Someday I'm going to come up with a better way of doing all this, but for now we've still got the very Frankenstein-y, very, very Airwindows style homebrew thing. This is a mic from a Rode video mic. It is cardioid, and it is a condenser mic element that's capable, it's an electric condenser mic element that's capable of running on very low voltage. It's got the little transistor inside it to power it. And again, it was very tricky setting it up. Like, I think maybe the way you have to do these is that the element, that third hot is left, right, and then the mic element, that's actually ground. And then what's supposed to be ground is the positive voltage if and only if the voltage drop is exactly the right amount to tell the phone or the Mac to turn on the power for that. So getting that to work was an absolute bear. The one great thing about it is that once I got it to work, I don't need to run additional converters or inputs, because it's not always super easy to patch through a thing. It's like, okay, I have an input and my microphone is going into channel 10. How do I get OBS to select specifically channel 10, for the microphone input? Sometimes it's not really great because, oh dear, my phone carrying on. I will get harassed by telemarketers on a regular basis. I probably need to move it to another room so I can't even hear it while I'm recording. So yeah. Now for doing the plug-in making, I've got one of these. And that's more fun to look at. You can set it here and I'll put it back later. These started out as Sennheiser HD600s. They aren't your daddy's Sennheiser HD600s. I stripped them so that it's just the diaphragm exposed right there. The back is open to the air. I can kill these by poking them with my finger, so I'm careful not to do that. And they're open ear. This would probably work for the Voice Trick plugin quite well. In fact, I'm hoping to experiment with that at some point to try to track stuff and have these be the headphones that I'm monitoring with, because if you're wearing these, you can hear everything super well because there's nothing in the way at all. There's literally a hole there through to the outside air. It's very, very open back. Very, very, very open back indeed. And those are pretty good quality as far as the headphones are concerned. I'm running them off of my Lavry, which I hope to bring back into service for the main rig at some point. But I've got that running off of the laptop that I code on. And the Lavry DA10 has a really powerful headphone amplifier. It's very impressive. So I endorse that very much. As far as the frequency response and sensitivity specs, frequency response of those, especially as I have them done, is very adequate. And the sensitivity almost doesn't matter because it's the Lavry. Those are 600 ohm headphones, if I'm not mistaken. So it's possible that in some systems they would not be able to get loud, but the Lavry has very powerful amplifiers. Translate, they don't translate. There's a reason for that. The reason they don't translate is something that I've explained before, and I'll run over it again. Headphones aren't the same as speakers. With headphones, if you have a brief peak, a spike in the audio that's going like this, then that could be projected to your ear real directly. If you're doing speakers, your environment is going to produce echoes and reverberations past an initial echo. So you'll get this, and then what's happening in your environment is that the early reflection will hit here, and your ear will kind of tune it out, but you feel it. And then the next early reflection hits, and then, the sound is bouncing off of your walls, and it's coming back to you again, and it's becoming a reverberation. And this is one of the reasons why we use diffusion rather than exclusively absorption. Including in even mastering studios, we'll use diffusion and not just only absorption always. Because it's useful to have that going on. It will help with getting a sense of where the mix is balanced between large, brief things and lots of additional stuff. If you have not enough room sound in your room, and it needs to not feed back, like if you have a room sound and it's just going honk, there's a loud ring. So anything that hits this frequency becomes extremely loud. And because your room resonates at this frequency, that's not helpful. But diffusion and suppressing resonances while still having the room contribute something is what will give you the ability to have brief sounds in the mix that would get by you on headphones and still be able to interpret them and what they are and how loud they are. Like you'll have a nice diffuse fadeaway, and that'll give you the sense of what's actually contained within the mix. You don't hear only the body of things, you'll also hear some of the peaks. And in headphones, the reason headphones don't translate onto speakers is because with any properly designed headphones, those peaks will get through without a lot of sustain. They're not going to keep vibrating the headphones like half a second after you've made the sound. Headphones are meant to get the heck out of the way, so it'll let you hear really deeply into the sound, but you're not getting a sense of the balances. And that's the long and short of it. So transfer functions, S-shaped transfer functions. I wish you could draw pictures too, because I will just have to guess at that. The thing about so let's see. I mean like this. As stuff gets louder, it starts getting louder, and then there's a flat top, but instead of just clipping at this point and just continuing onwards, it starts getting louder again. So you got an area where it's flat and then an area where it gets louder some more. Is that what you mean? Because this is doable. I don't think people normally consider that to be useful. But you totally could. Maybe that'd be a good idea for me to play with. Because you could easily do multiple bands. Like you can do a transfer function. Actually, no, you can't do that. I just drew a line where it goes back down again. The one thing you can't do is, well, that's not true either. Maybe you could do that, but the thing is there are two different points for what you can't do with the transfer function is have this axis go back on itself. So anything that you do, whether it be going back down in volume again, it always has to be continuing onwards in this direction. So you can't do this. But you could do that as a transfer function. It would sound incredibly horrible, but you could, because the amplitude in this direction is continuing to get louder and you're just mapping different things onto it. I'm going to tack the name remap onto this because I had a plugin that I was experimenting with that didn't really amount to anything that would end up being kind of like that. The idea would be to have a zone that is either more saturated at a certain point, or if you did this, you would be undistorting stuff. If there was a zone where it's like this is where it clips, and you were able to position the node in the correct position, you'd be able to expand out where the clip was, and it would be quieter, and then the zone where it started to hit the clip, you'd start getting louder real fast, and then it would flatten back out again. And the size of it would matter, like you could do something like that in the middle of the transfer function. Every little departure from straight will cause some sonic damage. But, this is certainly a thing. I just don't have the algorithm right at the moment. You'd be calculating it out to how do I make it so that it goes louder like this and then stops getting louder again and then starts getting louder some more. Kind of like the inverse behavior. So it'd be kind of a second order effect. You're doing the same thing as if you were taking the sine wave behavior and having it continue to go through like 1.5 and then back down again, but you'd be keeping track of it so that at that 1.5 point, if you knew that that was where you were at, you would keep track of how much quieter you were than 1.57 and subtract that from your 1.57 so that it would continue going in this way again. And then it would be kind of curving around and putting another level in there. So that'd be a thing. That'd be a thing about taking that point, which is where the sine wave saturates, as a final number, and putting in a special condition where it would take that and then start handling it in a different way. So yep. It would be possible to do an S-shaped transfer curve, and that's a good idea for me to try to do. I can probably try doing that at some point in June, I think. Seems like it'd be fun to add. So next up, actually I've got an earlier comment. Patrick Alfinar Says, when I mix music, do I still just make it sound nice but technically not correct? Yes. Yes. When I mix music, there's no such thing as technically correct. Have you heard my music? I'm very, very happy to make stuff that has ugly, nasty qualities in various different ways, if that's what I feel like, if that's the noise that I feel like making. The technical knowledge is about letting you get to where you can make a thing, do something. So, when actually mixing or playing instruments, when playing notes and that kind of stuff, the technical kind of goes away. I'm not interested in reconstructing something according to, and this has come back to bite me because I use my music for my own audio, demonstrating plugins, and people often complain loudly about that kind of stuff. But it's like, well, then download the plugin, you have that for free, then use your own music. That's what you're supposed to do anyway. But I don't consider the mixing is not supposed to be just only correct. It's boring if it's just only correct. There needs to be stuff in the mix that's unexpected or discontinuous. Just something has to poke out. Otherwise, the first word that comes to mind is Journey, which is kind of tacky because they're a perfectly fine band. But like Journey is also known for being sort of album-oriented rock. It could even wind up on one of my Analyze Records live streams. It's going to be a while before I do those, I can see. But eventually I'll be doing those on Wednesday. And one of the things about Journey is that they have a very glossy, polished production where everything is basically correct. Journey mixes are very, very technically correct, but that stops them from being particularly raunchy, weird, unexpected. It's smooth. When you do stuff and it's super duper technically correct, it comes out real smooth and inoffensive. And that's a limiting factor. It means that you can do stuff that is extremely timeless and evergreen, because there's nothing wrong about what you've done. But generally you need a hook. You need something extra going on in order to really make an artistic point. Now, Robert Kennedy above mentions Airwindows plugins bundled with Traction. How did that come about? Was it a collaboration? Kinda. Because I'm doing open source. So somebody tipped off the people with Traction that is another open source. I think that's some kind of open source. I think they're GPL and or commercial in that you can generate plugins with Traction or something like that. I may be confusing them with another project. But the idea with theirs is, this is open source. You can generate stuff for free if it's GPL'd. Otherwise, you have to pay us. And my stuff is MIT licensed, meaning that it is not as restrictive as that. So GPL folks can use my stuff in their thing. And I heard about Traction after the fact. I didn't talk to them and say, why don't you do this? Instead, somebody saw that I had a body of work out there as MIT license. And were like, hey guys, why don't you include all of this in your product? And then you can sell access to that and make it free using GPL, but then you can sell your stuff and include their stuff. And they went, gosh, I guess. And then the person responsible for doing it actually emailed me. And they were like, did you know that your licensing lets us do this? Are you okay with that? Because they recognized that gave the possibility of the licensing, meaning they could take my plugins and include them in their product. It's not my responsibility to update their stuff, mind you. They have to follow along. And if there are any changes on the Airwindows GitHub, it's their problem keeping up with it. Like if they have their local copy of whatever, it's their problem updating it. I'm not responsible for making sure that they are up to speed. I'm not responsible for making sure that they have Podcast Deluxe from yesterday. They are on the treadmill of keeping up with me. Good luck. And the fellow responsible for that was asking me, do you know that I can do this? Are you okay with this? Because he realized that he is able to use the MIT licensed stuff in a context where people who were going to keep it open source had to make their thing GPL, because their audio engine is GPL. Or if it was proprietary licensed, technically I believe they still have to shout me out as part of the MIT license, but that's basically just a credit thing. And I think that holds. But the MIT license doesn't require that anything that you do also has to be open source. The GPL does that. The GPL is viral. The MIT license is not. So it means people can use Airwindows code in commercial plugins that are sold for pay, and you can't have otherwise. Even me, I can't have. So long as they credit me for what code that I contributed code. Possibly it would be good class to specify which plugin was being included, but I'm not sure that's necessarily part of it. And that's why they had to ask me if I was okay with that. And I told them yes, that I chose MIT license for that reason. My reasoning there is as follows. I am in the music business, and the music business is based on rampant exploitation everywhere you turn. So basically, in order to succeed in the music business, you have to let other people basically feed off of you and exploit you. And doing that, letting other people get, ride on your creations or whatever, is the way that works. Always has been, probably always will be, because there are so many people wanting to find success and popularity in the music business, more of them than there are room for that. I don't know about their GUI because I didn't look into it that closely. I believe I tried to run it and got confused and I didn't know how to do it, so I stopped. I think that's how that worked. I remember I fooled with it a little bit and went, okay, you lost me. I don't know how to make this work. It was the same thing with Blue Cat's thing. Blue Cat has a scripting engine called like Script and Play or something, plugin script. And Guillaume from Blue Cat intentionally made that with the intention of letting people like me make whole plugins that you would make your own GUI and all of this kind of stuff, and then use your algorithms or like programming language. He had his own programming language, which was not as efficient as C or C++, but still, basically would work. And I played with Blue Cat's thing and couldn't make that work either. Some of these guys, they're just doing these things where, yes, it's an engine that makes everything very super easy and does all the work for you, except for that in order to use it, it's like learning a whole programming language, and that's not my strong suit. So there's been a whole chain of stuff like that where I was just too dumb to do it. I was too dumb to, what was the other one? Yeah, Juice. I looked into the Juice graphics layer and couldn't make head or tail of it, couldn't figure it out. I looked into Blue Cat plugin script, couldn't figure it out. I looked into Traction and how they boasted that you could make your own sample instrument and make your own GUI using that, and I got nowhere and couldn't figure it out. And I've recently jumped on to a Patreon, which is the most recent guy. Somebody pointed him out, said, hey, here's somebody who is doing a graphics layer based on what used to be part of Reaper. And the Reaper, Kakos, the Reaper folks, were doing a plug-in architecture for graphics, and this fella took it over because it was an open source project. And has been maintaining it, and I watched one of his videos and stuff, and his ideas were, he's going to take this graphics layer that originally came from Kakos and Reaper and make it available for plugins on the web. It currently works only in Chrome, which is no help to me because I'm running Firefox. But plugins on the web, and he's talking about how he wants to do vector graphics in the plugin engine. And he's maintaining this open source project, and he only had about $200 a month and stuff. And I was like, I like you. He seemed nice. He seemed to be doing a good thing. So I jumped on his Patreon. Anybody feels like doing the same thing, then, by all means do so. We'll all do the best we can with whatever we got. However, that doesn't mean that I can... Well, Blue Cat may possibly have dropped that when it didn't take off. See, that's one of the things with being a commercial software developer, is you can't put a bunch of stuff on your site that's not working for people. I'm in a very different position. I'm Chris from Airwindows. Airwindows gets to be like every week something happens. It could be literally anything. It doesn't matter whether it's incredibly popular, like Console is likely to be very popular, Console 6, or this dumb arbitrary plugin that does something that's completely useless. I've got a somebody on another forum, somebody on KVR is asking me, can I make a really degraded tape plugin? And I was like, here's some things that I could do. And they're like, oh, but I know you can't do that because where would be the market for that? I'm like, ha ha ha. Market, you say? I don't have to care. I can do whatever I like because I'm not dependent upon the stuff that I do. I think I have seen Heiss. I think actually Heiss is the people who are also using Airwindows stuff. Heiss are the people before Traction who came and said, are you sure that, test, don't talk about that. David, I'm going to ask you to remove that comment. If you don't remove it, I'll remove it for you. Actually, no, I will remove it for you. Yeah, the reason I'm going to remove that is because I deal with that kind of stuff by open source. I don't deal with that kind of stuff by cracking anybody else's copy protection. Instead, I make that stuff unnecessary. So I'm not super mad or anything like that, but we don't talk about cracks in here. Move on to where you no longer need to use that at all, is my advice there. But yeah, what was I talking about? Heiss. Yeah, Heiss are the people who came to me and said, are you aware that your licensing lets us do this, and are you okay with that? And yeah, no problem. Just, don't talk about cracks. It would only get me in trouble, frankly. But plus, I don't really approve of it. I don't have a lot of that stuff kicking around. I have like movies and MP3s and things kicking around. I never really made a practice of running around with software, possibly because I just don't trust cracked stuff. I don't trust that it's not going to have some kind of horrible Trojans or whatever, so I never got into it. There is the whole information wants to be free kind of thing, and the whole pirate freedom, get to use everything kind of stuff. It's all very complicated. It's a complicated question. I don't think it's necessarily as simple as folk like Pace, iLock stuff would have you believe, but all the same. Yeah, Heiss, that is the people who said, can we use your code? Are you aware that this allows us to do this? And I said, by all means, yes, use it. That's why I'm doing it, for that reason. That's what I'm expecting. You just got to credit me. And I tried working with their sampler, and I wasn't able to figure it out. So that's another one of those ones where people making their GUIs, and I wasn't able to figure that out. So yeah, maybe someday somebody will do something that I can understand. Or we'll make some kind of nice, it'll be a Minecraft interface instead, and you'll assemble blocks to control your plugin. but there's bound to be something. It's just that the folks who were able to work on this very high level, and that's why I'm wondering whether maybe the most recent one, the guy that's working on the stuff that originally came from Reaper, maybe he's working on something where I'll be able to figure it out. Because Juice really lost me. Juice was really complicated, and I couldn't even begin with that stuff. It was too much heavy lifting. And at some point, I'm just going to have to learn that sort of thing. I think that's what that's going to have to be. Last coffee for the last 35 minutes of stream. Woot. So yeah, it's been an interesting week with the coming out with... One thing I've done is I've actually worked ahead so that I can get into like developing stuff like this and this. I had to take some time to wire up my kick drum booster with the transformer in it and stuff. And I'm going to see whether I can set myself some time to do this remap thing, figure out how to make that work. Julie. Julie, my favorite snake oil hater. I was actually just talking about, I was just talking with White Sea about that, and I'll tell you about it simply because it might, you might want to bear this in mind. Much like the YouTube up thumbs and down thumbs, where I'm not sure it's literally like this, but effectively YouTube up thumb and down thumb is the same button. And the label on that button is engagement. You got somebody to react. That's all. So if Mr. Snake Oil Dude really annoys you, the most aggressive thing you can do for shutting that guy down is not complain about him. Because complaining about him will cause attention. And we're into something, probably a thing that he's going to come out with fairly soon, and he shouted me out a couple of times in it, which I appreciated. But the reason he shouted me out was that he's doing another whole video about that. He wanted to know whether he had everything right, and he did not. Some stuff was phrased in a funny way. Some stuff was maybe, to really explain it rigorously would be in different kinds of ways. And I was like, dude, post it anyway. For a variety of reasons. One, because you shouldn't assume that you can be just like, I understand everything now and I'm done. We're all learning. But two, your best friend is saying stuff that's slightly wrong, so people will come out of the woodwork and flame you because that's engagement. And that gets people excited and worked up, and they start having a big argument about it. And there's some folks that I think have done that intentionally in the plugin world, where they'll have bugs and things and just sort of not really bother dealing with them because it's generating a lot of complaints and bouncing a lot of threads and stuff. Being a little bit, dangerous, antagonistic, controversial is always helpful as far as just social media management. Being nice isn't necessarily the best or most optimal social media management, which is part of the reason that our internet world has turned as unpleasant as it did over the last, I don't know how many years it's been, lots of them. But yeah, White Sea is going to come out with a video. I certainly would recommend watching it. It's interesting. And many of the points are correct, but then I also pointed out, you could have phrased this and this and this and this and this slightly differently. But on the whole, well done. On the whole, it's basically right. So your question, Jolie, however, was, am I going to be developing a multi-channel plug that makes the routing for Console 6 simpler and more universal in all DAWs? The trouble is, probably not. And I'll tell you why. I don't have good understandable examples for doing a basic, simple VST 2.4 plugin that extends what VST expects to do in that way. Like I've heard in some cases you can do 64 channels, in some cases you can do 16, you can do this and that and the other thing and so on. That's going to be different for all the different hosts. I already run into stuff where I'm doing something and people will come out of the woodwork and go, you know, your plugin is broken on thus and so and this and that and the other thing and stuff. And it's like the graphics layer or whatever. It's like, yeah, in this plugin, it doesn't show the graphics. I don't get the sliders. And I'm like, my plugin doesn't have the code to show the sliders. That's within the DAW that you're using, so I can't fix it. You know, and even leaving that stuff out, even leaving out stuff that is beyond the scope of normal VST, I still run into constant problems with DAWs that are poorly coded or whatever and aren't doing the what you would want. So the chances of making a big old multi-channel plug that you can sit in Reaper or whatever and be like, just route everything to this, is and more universal in DAWs is really the killer there. Like, given good enough examples, given something that I could look at and be like, maybe if I did this and that and the other thing, and I told it that it had this many channels and so on and so forth, and it runs in this version of Reaper, it's possible that I could do something like that, especially if somebody had something like that going on or was able to say, oh, hey, change this number, and then duplicate these declarations in the input and so on and so forth, and then that might work. If that was possible, I could conceivably make such a plug. I'm also told that that would be very inefficient, that eats your CPU really badly and is not necessarily a win. It's possible to do something like that when it's non-typical VST. And audio units are already multi-channel, so most of the stuff that I do that isn't literally stereo in audio units is end-to-end, so that's already taken care of. But in VST land or in stereo plugins and stuff, more universal in DAWs is what's going to kill you, and I can't get into it. Even though I just said, like, controversy is engagement. Controversy is your friend. What I should do is make a elaborate multi-channel plugin and claim that it's the best thing ever and that it won't work for freaking anybody. I could do that to generate more engagement and have everybody up in arms, freaking out and going, it doesn't work for me, it doesn't work, but I don't want to. I don't want to. Even though it would be more engagement, I totes don't want to. So I think I've seen the GUI direction that it went with for Airwindows and Waveform. I think I've seen that. I suppose I could have a quick. I'll just copy that. David, as far as the White Sea video, no, it is not. It is not about Ditherfloat. That's too obscure, frankly. I haven't even updated everything. Let's see. So, oh god, that's hilarious. Okay, so the GUI direction they did for Airwindows and Waveform is like a sort of funky homebrew thing with little trim pots. Hopefully you don't have to click literally on that tiny movable part and stay within that in order for it to work, but that's their problem, not mine. Okay, cool. I wouldn't choose to do that, but by all means. If they don't like it, they can do something else. It's their problem and not mine. But yeah. So, RA Recordings Rick asks, do newer versions of a DAW have an improvement in audio quality? Depends. My stuff doesn't run natively in Pro Tools, but Pro Tools has gone through some changes. Like back in the day, Pro Tools, as near as I can tell, did a bunch of things regarding like, okay, we're doing this mix and then storing it in a temporary variable, which is a 16-bit, like not even a float. It's like and not necessarily an int, but for whatever reason, like they were storing stuff and mixing stuff in ways where stuff just would kind of grind. And it was because the early Pro Tools mix bus had stuff going on where if you moved a fader, the depth collapsed because it would go through several different stages of retruncating to new fixed point formats. And if I'm not mistaken, on versions of Pro Tools that old, and I know I see that you're not talking about Pro Tools. I think on some versions of Pro Tools that old, if you did your fader thing and went, okay, this is the one where you move the fader a little bit and the soundstage collapses, if you went to exactly -6 dB, it would be fine again because it would be bit shift gain. And that digital is weird the way that it works that way. There's going to be areas where it is optimally damaging of the sound or not. Now, as far as newer versions of Cubase, there's a variety of things about Cubase and Steinberg that I find challenging. Like, I don't know whether there's going to be older versions where they didn't have the 64-bit mix bus available, and I think maybe they are, I mean, put it this way. Obviously, Cubase has a 64-bit mix bus available because that's part of what's available in the VST format. If it's available in the format, then it's available in Cubase. And there's going to be an earlier version of Cubase that didn't have that, so you would be able to do that. However, I'm not sure to what extent different versions, because it's all a matter of under the hood, you're basically doing just a bunch of math. And the amount of math that you're doing is going to have an effect on the really delicate stuff in the mix and the way that it's gain staged and assembled and the sequence of operations that are done. But that doesn't necessarily mean that newer makes it better. So it depends, and it's all on this level of subtlety where you're going to be really hard pressed to tell. It's that kind of thing which I've often observed where if you're listening to audiophile style music and you do something that is a improvement so that it's like, oh, just a little bit more magic, that's the scale of stuff where you're hearing it like once every 30 seconds or once every 5 minutes. A moment comes up and you're like, oh, I got it. Wow, that was really nice. And it's worth doing that stuff, but you're never going to be able to pick it out twice in the same place. The DAWs are all like that. You can use a DAW and say, have it be one of those ones where it's not as good because there's something in the summing and mathematics of it that's producing artifacts or whatever that are causing some form of aliasing or quantization or whatever, and you can pick it out, say, once every 20 seconds. So you're working with the DAW, and you're listening to the DAW for like 6 or so minutes, and there's been a succession of moments like here and here and here, and about 4 times you're like, yeah, that didn't seem quite right. But you can't put your finger on it. It's too fugitive. It's too delicate to tell. So for that reason, this becomes just hard stuff to pin down. And newer doesn't necessarily mean better. You can have newer stuff that is doing that stuff more poorly, or you can have newer stuff that is doing that stuff better. Logic went through a series of changes where they started their internal calculations when they're doing their mixes. They were initially doing their mixes all to 32-bit floats. So it was having that whole dither float thing that I talk about, and they changed it in some form of recent version of Logic. I don't know exactly when, where it's like, oh, hey, we have a 64-bit summing engine. All that means is once you've gone through your plugins and stuff, which are all running at 32-bit float, and they go to the summing engine, once you're coming out the bottom of the plugins, they take that 32-bit float and they just upsample it to double precision. And then the summing engine is all being done in double precision because you can, because it's cheap, because why not? And that's one of those things where, it's likely to end up sounding better in that extremely fugitive way. And I think it's worth doing. But you're never going to be able to pin it down from one moment to the next. You're never going to be able to double blind test it. It's just too subtle of a change. And it's all that kind of stuff. Like when you're listening to the output of a DAW in, say, OS X, you're going back into core audio again, and you're passing stuff around in various ways, and then the core audio itself is going to be handing stuff to your converters in a particular kind of way. And that's not even getting into whether you're handing stuff to the converters with enough jitter that the converter will have a harder or easier time to smooth out the timing of the information that it's getting and sort of reclock it. Because you can reclock anything as long as you have enough latency to do it in. But if you're running very low latency, you're going to be much more dependent upon when did it give you that last bit of information. And the only way to get around jitter is incurring more latency and smoothing it out. It takes time to smooth out a bit stream. And if you have very low latency in your recording and mixing and stuff, then your entire engine from beginning to end, out through the speakers, is going to be susceptible to slight hesitation. Therefore, our whole sample stream has to slow down enough to catch this slightly late one or whatever, or earlier you can drop samples or things like that. But it's always got to try to catch up to what the speed of the information being handed to it is. And again, that's all about latency. It's all about how low latency can you use and how much latency can you stand for the purposes of smoothing out jitter in the sound. So, Jolie, I see what you got to say as far as the expert thing, but you should bear in mind, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, earlier than that, I was that guy. I'll tell you straight up, I was that guy. And that's why I'm always very protective of folks like that. I'm very protective of David. David Pixley in the stream right now is kind of experimental musician guy, does mastering for folks sometimes, and likes really deconstructing and doing weird things with the sound. And those things don't necessarily have to sound great, but that kind of experimentalism was what leads you somewhere, and it leads you to having your own ideas. By the same token, I'm pretty sure that Whitesea is going to end up having his own ideas and progressively getting closer and closer to being correct about stuff. Now, I could do the whole CinemaSins, and CinemaSins is terrible, but I could do the whole CinemaSins thing of going through a Whitesea video and being like, okay, this is not quite correct, this is phrased strangely, this is misleading, so on and so forth. But I will happily watch that stuff and not feel bothered by it, because none of us are really experts. We're all just trying to find our way. If there's stuff that you're running into that you either disagree strongly with, and I've had people with enormously good reputations telling me that the floating point dither is completely nonsense or bad or even dangerous. And I simply don't agree. If they say, oh, you can't hear that in double-blind tests, I would be the first person to agree with. I'm just doing a kind of pedantic thing with that stuff, and it doesn't necessarily amount to big striking changes that anybody can hear. But we're all in the same boat as far as you gotta take stuff with a grain of salt, always, 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 always. So yeah, let me keep looking around about some of these commentary. That was a really fun GUI for the waveform stuff. Those are like imitation tiny little trim pots. Yeah. And yeah, if you're doing mixing or anything where the latency doesn't matter, using larger buffers is generally going to help. Now, that's not to say that using larger buffers is always going to help sonically. If it's something like it might very well help sonically in just your regular DAW or any given converter. Certain converters, like my Lavry, I'd like to get more Lavry. At some point I will. But the Lavry DA10 has 3 settings for the latency. And it's called a PLL. It's a phase-locked loop. And a phase-locked loop is the thing that follows the stream of information coming in. And it takes the stream of information coming in and it retimes it in such a way that it's perfectly evenly. And the better that it retimes it, the more it can suppress distortion that's produced by the information coming in more sporadically. Like 3 figures and all of a sudden a little pause and then another one and so on and so forth. So you got wide phase lock looped, and that's low latency. And then there's a narrow phase lock loop, which is less able to absorb. There's also a flexibility aspect in there, in that the wide phase lock loop will produce audio even if the input stream is really bad, like lots of jitter going on. The narrower one, it'll run a little more latency, and it'll be more susceptible to like dropping samples if the information is just all over the map and the jitter is really bad. The timing of it is, like samples coming in. If your samples are coming in like this, if the samples are coming in like this, in time-wise, and you need to respace them so that they're coming in like this, and they're nice and even. A wide phase lock loop will produce an output that's kind of close to that. It'll be like, okay, this, and then we're going to wait for a while, and then some more. A narrower phase lock loop will be able to get closer to the even spacing, but then if you've got a big gap in here, the narrower phase lock loop could fail to come up with a sample for that point, and it would drop out. And then the last one that the Lavry has is crystal. And crystal basically means the regularity of the stream is incredibly important. We're basically just going with a perfect thing and varying it only in the most slight way. So the spacing of the input information has to also be pretty even. Or if it's not even, then you run a really large latency. And that is one of the things that will happen with the Lavry, is if you've got it set on crystal, then your face is low latency too, Chris. If you've got it set on crystal, then it is going to run more latency, because it's just making stuff be constrained to a much less flexible time stream of samples. So it is very possible, even with just regular stuff, that if you use more latency and larger buffer sizes, you might be able to get your monitoring to sound better. Now, once you've mixed it down to a file, as long as you haven't gone out of the box, it will make no difference whatsoever. One of the things about jitter and latency and stuff like that is that affects only monitoring. It does not affect in the box summing and calculation, because that in the abstract is always going to be just a perfect succession of samples. And if you go out to analog and then recapture it again, that's when the jitter stuff can start affecting you. But if you're just doing stuff in the box, latency and jitter and these things are going to affect your monitoring. It's going to affect how well you hear stuff. It's not going to touch the sound of the actual audio at all. Which is worth noting, because it's not always the case that if you're doing something like that and it's sounding less than it could, that you've necessarily hurt your audio. You're not necessarily hurting your audio by dealing with playback that has a lot of jitter. The only way that it's going to hurt your audio is if it's affecting the actual data being passed through. It's only a monitoring issue. Kind of like this. Check this out. Random bastel noise. That I was just noticing that the mixing board and stuff have got sounds coming through. And Chris sends this final mix from out to VHS and back. Alrighty then. Actually, you know who else does that? Jexus. WC Ologarb, synthesizer god. Really likes, and you know, one of the things about Jexus that I absolutely enjoy is the reality of that. Quick answer to Bo. I know I haven't tried Maths by Soka Labs. Too busy making new stuff. I generally won't have tried other people's plugins for things. But yeah, one of the neat things about Jexus in that is very akin to my own way of thinking. When you watch a Jexus video, it's those crazy old synthesizers and stuff, and it's like, you know, wow, how did you get that VHS effect? By using a VHS. One of the ways that Jexus did what he did back in 2007 and so, and presumably is going to keep doing it. Oh, we'll see what his new Patreon-backed version is like. I know he was getting rid of some of the old gear, but during the time when he was doing the synthesizer demo videos, JEXUS, one of the techniques that he had was to take his video and stuff and dump it onto actual VHS machines with actual like color adjusters and things like that, and then make them be really badly out of alignment and stuff. So when you see your WC Ologarb video, your Jexus synthesizer video, that's the real deal. When you see the all crazy VHS out, like severely destroyed stuff, and like, wow, what a cool visual effect. Where's my After Effects thing that lets me do that? Well, nope, none of it is fake. It's all literally real VHS mistracking, and real, just it's getting trashed in that way. So it's very much like somebody recording to an analog tape deck. You know, I've always been rather drawn to analog tape decks and the idea of like, oh, could I get something like that? I have hopes of putting together a, no, Maths would not be a simulation of the Eurorack module if Bo is describing it correctly. I've often been rather drawn to the idea of getting a real multitrack, and the closest I had to that was a TIAC 3340 quarter-inch 4-track. And I've even done music on those. I've been tempted to try to get a real multi-track that runs on tape and stuff. One of the problems with that is they're heinously expensive. Getting the machines is not expensive. Maintaining them is difficult. Getting tape is very expensive. And that's kind of like what Jexus is doing with the VHS stuff. I mean, if that's your aesthetic. If your aesthetic is a old Porta Studio, then what you need to do is get an old Porta Studio and get a whole bunch of cassette tapes from somewhere and start doing it. Because that is by far the easiest and best way to get there. Now, my aesthetic hasn't always been that way. Often when I'm doing music, I'm attracted to like your old Pink Floyd or whatever. And stuff like old Pink Floyd uses things like very simple miking, sometimes like old tube consoles and recorders and things like that, depending upon just how old it is. But you're not going to get there with just a Portastudio. You're not going to get there with just a cassette recorder, because that is its own kind of lo-fi that is much lower in fire than what professional bands were able to use back in the day. So doing the DAW thing is actually a lot closer to that stuff than you'd think. Because when those things were done properly, like, here's a good example. The Beatles' recordings were always being done as, I recognize that name now. Somebody mentioned Tainbach, and I just watched a video by that guy with super antique 1950s oscillator. That was pretty amazing. Although it did seem kind of limiting in that there was a bunch of stuff you wouldn't be able to do with that unless you just sampled it and played it off of a laptop or whatever, which is defeating the purpose. But I did like it. I thought that was very cool. Like here, the bit that I just showed you just now. This is the Bastille. We'll play you out with 5 minutes of, well, maybe not 5 minutes, but here's what's making this noise. Filter. It's being synced off of the central brain and aux and the red Bastille Castle. I love this kind of stuff. This is my jam. So that's the kind of stuff, well, maybe that was quiet. I didn't really check the levels of it. I think I could probably crank it an awful lot more to get it up to a proper level. But it's, and I'm sure you didn't hear me talking. But that's not that dissimilar to what Hainbach is doing. It's just that, this is the modern day. So you can use old 1950s measuring equipment. And one thing that will give you is that it's all like brutally old antique tube-based things with these big old capacitors and resistors on them. And that is very neat in its own way. But you can also do it with little CMOS circuits and things like that. What's inside a Bastille Castle is actually a couple of different little chips that are sort of programmable chips. And all it's doing is it's taking a couple of inputs and a couple of outputs and doing really crude sort of square wavy things and stuff. It's doing a calculation like a little tiny computer and giving the output, and there's a couple of different ways of doing it. I've got it patched into all these jacks by just wiring stuff onto the circuit board. But what a Castle is built out of is this very, very simple little chip, and there's not all that much to it. There's the little chip, and you have to power the chip with voltage. And you got some inputs, you got some outputs, you've got some resistors connecting to it. But, and yeah, Forbidden Planet vibe is exactly what I'm after. And Hainbach, with his 1950s measuring equipment, will do a more sophisticated version of getting to that Forbidden Planet vibe if he wants. Because to do that, you're taking some of these weird old pieces of equipment that very powerful sawtooth waves and things, and hooking them together to do strange things. Well, the Bastel Castle can take little 5-volt computer chips, and you take those and program it a certain way and then hook the inputs and outputs together to do exactly the same really weird things. It's just in this microscopic level rather than this big, powerful 400-volt tube-powered level. So they kind of all go to the same place in some ways. They kind of all go to the same place. And, I will tell you that one of the things I'm considering, and I'm increasingly inclined to do this, I just don't know exactly when I'm going to start doing it. I intend to take some kind of time, figure out a time or a plan where I will start doing a second music stream, and it may be I might do that to celebrate getting 500 Patreon subscribers or something. Once I'm beyond 500 Patreon subscribers, I will celebrate by doing an ambient stream every week, as well as a sort of house music has a beat kind of stream, which is what I've been doing on Tuesdays. And that would be very much the Forbidden Planet vibe kind of thing, because as much as I'm drawn to the housey type stuff, and some of the stuff that I've done, like the recent development of that kick drum modification, where I'm making the DFAM be better using a transformer and a capacitor. I explained that earlier in this stream, so watch the replay of it. I'm also drawn to just the straight up Forbidden Planet style space music kind of thing. And when you have me playing with the Bastel there, that's so my jam. Ideally, I'm going to have a whole pile of these little perf board things, and I'll come up with ways, I already know how to make oscillators, I just haven't done them. I'll be making all manner of oscillators and figuring out ways to patch them together, much the same way that the Bastel Castle comes, with just these little pin headers rather than the jacks. The jacks and all that stuff just about doubled the cost of the Castle. It just made it be Eurorack capable that way. But the Castle comes with just these little pin headers. And you can take these, patch points and just patch them together and do very, very Forbidden Planet-y kind of things. So I intend to do those from raw parts. I intend to do those with stuff where, this actually goes back to the older plan that will no doubt still happen one day, where I was going to get a briefcase, and I've shown people the briefcase on earlier streams, and gone, this is how I could put Eurorack rails inside this briefcase, bolt them down, and then have lots of these just perf board things mounted on there with just little connections, so that there would be a whole sort of Forbidden Planet vibe secret briefcase making the most heinous noises, just wild stuff. And it would look like a bomb. It would look insane. And it would be incredibly daunting and difficult to deal with. It would be... One of the challenges there becomes, could I come up with a way of making it so that you could kind of tell what you were doing? Where you've got your... chips and things, some kind of labeling showing this is what this does, this is what that does. And your power supplies would be under the board, so that the stuff that is presented as pin headers, or IC sockets or whatever, are all relevant in some way, and they're labeled in some way, so you can kind of tell what you're doing. And everything has incredibly tiny LEDs on them, so that everything would be constantly blinking or lighting up, so you could see what was doing what. If something was doing a triangle wave, well, there'd be a tiny LED right on the point that you could patch into, and you'd watch it getting like brighter and darker and brighter and darker, and that would show you that it was a triangle wave and not a square wave, and it would also show you how fast it was going. And you'd basically just patch everything together on the basis of that. So that's an exciting concept. That is an exciting concept, which I think is a good enough point for me to sign off, as it is now a little bit past 1. I've already decided in the far future, if the Patreon ever gets to like $3,000 a month, you get 3 hours for all the streams if I get to $3,000 a month. But that's not yet. So we've been hanging out for 2 hours. I'm going to go and make maybe a little bit of lunch or another cup of coffee and chill for the rest of the day. So people have been asking me like, Chris, take it easy. Jeez, dude, you're doing too much. Like, well, I'm not really doing too much, but I am going to bid you good afternoon for now. So on that light, I have no idea what a postcard weevil is, but I guess I'm about to find out. I'll go and look it up. And I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.